Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into something kind of personal, especially for, those of us who've had experiences within Mormonism, faith transitions. And, we're trying to understand these faith transitions better by looking at it through this lens of adult development.
Now, we're definitely not here to debate like doctrine or tell anyone, what to believe at all. Really, this whole deep dive is about gaining like a fresh perspective on
Oh.
what can honestly be a really, really challenging experience, for a lot of people.
Now, have you ever felt like, your worldview was kind of shaken? Like maybe, just maybe, what we learned growing up didn't quite like fit with what we're encountering now as adults. It turns out there's all this research, this whole field of study that looks at those shifts, like how we make sense of the world as we mature.
Yeah, it's called adult development.
And what's really fascinating is this idea that like it challenges this old idea that our minds just stop developing after childhood.
Just like our physical bodies, our meaning-making abilities, they keep evolving throughout life. It doesn't just stop.
Okay, so like let's unpack this a little bit.
Right.
What does it actually mean for our minds to keep developing? I mean, is it like learning new stuff?
Well, it's not just about like, accumulating more information, like adding files to a computer.
Hmm.
It's more about transforming how we actually understand and integrate that information, how we see the world and how we see our place in it.
Think about, how kids learn
They
language,
don't like question, grammar rules. They just totally absorb it. Right.
right?
It's kind of similar for, how we absorb the worldviews that we grow up with.
Mm-hmm.
We absorb that dominant worldview often without even realizing it.
So in this case, like someone who's raised in Mormonism might just adopt that as their framework without even like thinking about it.
Exactly.
And that's not a bad thing, like in itself.
Developmental psychologist Robert Keegan, he calls this like the socialized mind. And he says that it's a necessary stage. We kind of adopt the prevailing values and beliefs of where we are, of our environment.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Adulthood throws some curveballs, right?
It sure does. We encounter diverse perspectives and all this new information, even, challenges to those earlier beliefs.
And this is where that initial worldview can be, shaken a bit. And it leads some to, what some people call a faith crisis.
You used a different phrase earlier, faith transition. I like
Right.
that. Crisis just sounds so negative, whereas transition sounds like a process, maybe even a positive one.
It is a subtle but significant, like, shift in language.
But it often reflects, an internal shift in how someone is processing their faith journey. They're not just reacting to this crisis. They're really actively engaging in this process of change and growth.
And our source material really emphasizes that this is totally normal. This is a normal part of adult development. It's not a sign of abandoning faith.
In fact, one of the most impactful lines that I read in the source was, according to source author's name, doubt is not the enemy of faith. It's the crucible in which faith is forged into something stronger and more resilient. I love that. So instead of fearing doubt, we should like lean into those questions as part of this natural progression.
Yep.
And that's where understanding these developmental stages can be really, really helpful. But it's important to note that these aren't meant to be, rigid boxes, that we put people in.
Right.
Think of them more like lenses to help us understand how our meaning making evolves throughout our lives.
Okay, so how do these stages actually work?
What does it look like to move through them, especially within this context of faith?
Specifically Mormonism.
Well, Robert Keegan, who we just mentioned, he outlined, several stages of adult development.
And one that's really relevant to faith transitions is this move from what he calls the instrumental mind to the socialized mind.
So in the instrumental mind, it's all about what works for me. Like rules are important, but mainly because they help me get what I want or they help me avoid punishment. But as we, mature, we move into this socialized mind.
Our sense of self expands.
Yeah.
We become really deeply connected to a group, and its values become our values. Belonging is like super important in this stage.
So for someone raised in Mormonism, this is the stage where the church's teachings become so deeply ingrained. It's not just these external rules anymore. It's part of who they are.
Exactly. And there's a lot of beauty and strength in that stage. It creates this really strong sense of community, shared purpose, moral grounding. But as we continue to, encounter different perspectives and grapple with these complex questions.
That's where things can get interesting, right? Because those deeply held beliefs might be challenged.
Precisely. And this is where the next stage of development, which Keegan calls the self-authoring mind, can emerge. But that transition, it can feel really unsettling, especially within a faith community that really emphasizes tradition.
And this is where it starts to hit home for me, and I'm sure for a lot of you listening as well. Because how do we reconcile these potentially conflicting forces? This desire to stay connected to our faith community while also honoring our own evolving understanding of the world.
We'll dive into that tension right after this. So we were talking about that tension between like staying connected to our faith community, like in this case, Mormonism, but also like honoring our own evolving, beliefs. It's like we're being pulled in these two opposite directions.
It's such a common experience in these faith transitions.
And it highlights just how important it is to do what Keegan calls transcend and include rather than transcend and repress.
Okay, so break that down a little. What does that even mean?
So as we move through these stages of adult development, like we were talking about,
We encounter these new perspectives and new ways of making meaning, right?
so transcending means we don't, just cling to our old ways of seeing things. We're open to like growth and change.
But including means we don't just throw out our previous understanding either, right?
Exactly. It's like, remember that Santa Claus thing we were
Uh,
talking about?
Just because we grow up and realize, okay, wait, Santa's not literally flying around the world in a sleigh,
Right.
that doesn't mean we have to totally dismiss like the joy and the wonder that that belief, brought to us as kids.
Or like, tell every kid who still believes that Santa's real that they're wrong.
Right.
It's about recognizing that those like earlier ways of making sense of the world served a purpose. They helped us, get to where we are now. And they can still hold meaning, even if we don't see them exactly the same way anymore.
So applying that to, faith transitions, transcend and include would mean honoring, the traditions and values that we learn within Mormonism, even while we're, wrestling with these tough questions or exploring different interpretations.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging that growth doesn't have to equal like total rejection.
It can be about finding this new, more nuanced way of integrating those beliefs into our evolving worldview.
Our source material actually uses this really interesting phrase, second naivete. And it basically says that, after this period of questioning and doubt, we can get to this place of like renewed faith.
But it's not the same naive faith that we had when we were kids. It's deeper, it's more grounded, it's more authentic.
Oh, I love faith.
Because it really gets at this idea that wrestling with doubt, going through that whole deconstruction thing, it doesn't have to be the end of faith. It can actually be the beginning of a much, richer and more meaningful, relationship with it.
And that's where this whole understanding of like adult development becomes so powerful, right? Because it gives us this framework for understanding those shits, for realizing we're not alone in those experiences. It's like part of this natural ongoing process of, growth. And I think it's, especially important within, the context of Mormonism, where there's historically been like a really strong emphasis on doctrinal certainty.
Yeah.
And honestly, a certain amount of discomfort with doubt.
Right. Questioning could be seen as a sign of weakness or a lack of faith.
Which is so unfortunate.
Because,
Yeah.
Doubt, when it's approached, constructively, can be incredibly, generative. It can lead to, a deeper understanding, greater empathy, and a more authentic, connection to our spirituality.
That just made me think of something else from our source material. They said, the unexamined faith is not worth having. It's like this challenge to really grapple with those tough questions, to really engage in that process of self-reflection and growth. But that can be really hard to do alone.
You're so right.
And that's why it's so important to, have a supportive community,
Mm-hmm.
people who can hold space for both your doubts and your faith.
People who can really listen without judgment and offer different, perspectives without trying to force you back into a certain box.
And I imagine that can be kind of tricky within, a faith tradition like Mormonism, which has such a strong sense of, community and shared belief. So how do we navigate those conversations, those relationships when, we're going through these transitions? Let's explore that right after we hear from our sponsors.
We've been talking about those tough conversations, right? Those ones we sometimes need to have when it feels like our faith journey is kind of taking us in new directions. Have you ever felt that tension? You're just not sure how to even begin talking about these things with family, with friends from, your faith community.
Oh, it's so incredibly common. And our source material actually had some really helpful advice for, how to navigate these conversations. One thing that really stood out to me was this idea of leading with empathy. Like really, really listening with the intent to actually understand what the other person is saying, not just, waiting for your turn to respond or to correct them.
Yeah, that's so important, especially like you said in a tradition like Mormonism where there's like such a big emphasis on, sharing your testimony, right? And trying to bring others to kind of the same understanding of truth.
Exactly.
But, during these transitions, during these like faith transitions, what people really need more than anything is to just feel heard.
To feel validated, not judged, not pressured.
Yeah, like you're creating this safe space for those conversations, even when even when they're really difficult. And one thing that our source material really emphasized was like just remembering that growth, personal growth, it rarely happens in this like straight line, right?
We might go back and forth. We might question things we once thought were like totally certain, and that's okay.
Yeah, it's all part of the process.
And I think it's important to remember that even within a community, a faith community like Mormonism, there's such a spectrum of belief and experience.
What really resonates for one person might not resonate for another, and that's okay. Like diversity of thought, diversity of experience, it can actually make a community stronger, not diminish it.
Yeah, it's like that quote that's often attributed to Brigham Young, although I'm pretty sure it's probably made up. But he goes, "I would teach the people to be careful how they condemn, for unless they are very careful, they will condemn the wrong person, and thereby bring upon themselves the wrath of that God whom they wish to serve." I know it's a mouthful, but whether it's like historically accurate or not, it's just such a good reminder for all of us, no matter where we are on our own like faith journeys, to approach these conversations with humility and with compassion.
Absolutely.
And if you're on the receiving end of that, if you were receiving judgment or criticism, just remember, it usually says a lot more about the other person,
Mhm.
about their anxieties and their insecurities than it does about you or your journey.
That's such a good point. Like we all do that, right? We project our own stuff onto others, especially when we're like feeling kind of threatened or, uncertain. But at the end of the day, your faith journey, it's your own.
It's between you and your higher power, however you understand that.
And while, community can be so supportive and so enriching, it's also really essential to cultivate that inner compass, that sense of personal integrity and that connection to something larger than yourself.
It's it's so fascinating to me how this whole like concept of adult development, like how it connects with spirituality,
Mm.
right? Especially within, a faith tradition like Mormonism.
It challenges us to really think about these things in new ways, to be more open to growth, to change, and to approach these conversations with so much more compassion for ourselves and for others.
Yeah, it's a lifelong journey.
And I think, the more we can learn to really embrace those questions, to embrace the doubts, to see them as part of that journey, the more meaningful and the more authentic I think our faith can become.
This deep dive has been honestly so full of like insightful aha moments for me.
And I really hope it's given you, the listener, a lot to think about too. If
Yeah.
this topic has resonated at all, please know you're not alone. There are
Yeah.
like so many resources available. There are communities out there where you can connect with people who are, navigating these same waters. We'll be sure to link to some of those in our show notes.
And until next time, keep asking those tough questions.
Keep embracing the journey.